Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our day-long event on symbolic dimensions of mediated activism in Inter-Asia. Our Dean, Professor Michael Carpini, will open our event with some remarks.
So good morning, everybody. My name, as Gobin said, is Michael Carpini, and I'm the dean here, and my role is purely ceremonial. I'm here to welcome you all to the Annenberg School and to the SSRC Symposium, Symbolic Dimensions of Mediated Activisms, Inter-Asia, in Inter-Asia. This event is sponsored by the SSRC, for which we're very grateful, but also by the Project for Advanced Research in Global Communication, or PARG, the Department of Sociology and the School of Arts and Sciences, and the Annenberg School. Just wanted to say that over the past decade, the Annenberg School has tried to shift its gaze somewhat from a focus on communication-related issues in the United States to those that are occurring across the globe. We've done that through things like setting up the Center for Global Communication Studies run by Monroe Price, PARG, which I just mentioned, partnerships with leading universities in China, Europe, India, and the Middle East, the hiring of experts and faculty such as Guobin, Deborah Moeller, Monroe Price, Sandra Gonzalez-Baylon, whose work and expertise lies in areas outside the United States. All of this effort has been to understand the role of the media and communication in all aspects of social, cultural, economic, and political life, but do that in a way that focuses on the local, the regional, the comparative, and the global. I've looked at the lineup of topics to be covered today and the speakers who are going to be covering those topics, and it's clear to me that it covers important, even fundamental issues that touch on all the things we're trying to do a little better here at the Annenberg School. So this is not an area I have great expertise in, and unfortunately I'll only be able to stay for the first session because my day job calls, but I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say, to learning from it, and I hope it's an excellent experience for all of you, and we can learn from each other on these important issues. So welcome to the Annenberg School, and I look forward to your conference.
Thank you very much, Michael. Next, Dr. Setni Shami from the SSRC Council, who directs the Inter-Asia program, will make some remarks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dean Carpini. Thank you to the Annenberg School, this lovely facility. It's my first time here, so I hope we come many times.
So do I.
And thank you very much for Goben Yang, who's part of a project I will briefly describe, and who has put together this wonderful symposium. So at the SSRC, we have our own sort of obscure terminology, and we say things like we do field building. And this is actually one example of something we would call field building, where we try to sort of transcend the barriers to knowledge that may exist, that may be geographical. In this case, we have a lot of focus on geographical sort of subdivisions of Asia that keep scholars apart and keep knowledge apart and stop people from communicating their research findings with one another. But also disciplinary, as you know, SSRC has always been focused and sort of behind interdisciplinary research. So this is also an example of a project which tries to further interdisciplinary communication. So we've been using this term Inter-Asia, sometimes with the hyphen and sometimes without, where actually our own internal communications team has been giving us a hard time. It's like, choose, does it have a hyphen or does it not have a hyphen? And I actually think the hyphen communicates some things at some times, and so for me it's sort of a deliberate choice when there is a hyphen and when there isn't, but that's sort of another story. But the point is that this project is not about sort of a bigger and greater Asia. It's not about just expanding the boundaries of Asia to include more. It's about connections, and it's about nodes within Asia that articulate those connections that could be global, that could be regional, that could be sub-regional, etc. And so this rather awkward phrase, inter-Asia, with or without the hyphen, is meant to sort of indicate that we're not thinking of some kind of sort of organically coherent whole, but we're rather trying to highlight the disjunctures, the connections, the awkwardness, the overlappings, and so on. And so I've been seeing it more and more. I don't claim we invented it, but I've been seeing it around more and more, and I hope it's doing sort of the intellectual work that we are hoping it does. So we have a program at the SSRC. The website, Holly, I don't know, is it up, the new sort of, or will be up soon? I mean, there's already a lot of information about Inter-Asia, but we've reorganized it recently to make it a bit more coherent. So I encourage you all to go to the website, look up the Inter-Asia program. At the moment, it consists of conferences, which we do roughly about every 2 years. We've had 4 of those: Dubai, Hong Kong, Singapore, Hong Kong, Istanbul. The next one we've just decided will be in South Korea. So those conferences are about every 2 years, and they bring together around 100 participants around different themes. We also have a postdoc competition that has supported about close to 40 postdoctoral fellows whose work is firmly sort of inter-Asian. And they really show us, they indicate to us that there is some traction, intellectual traction to this idea of inter-Asian work. We all talk about trans-regional research and how important it is to do trans-regional research, but it's still not exactly clear how you do it, and it's going to be different depending on theme, topic, geographies, etc. And so the postdoc fellowship and the workshops are, I think, a very, very important part of clarifying some of this, some of these intellectual challenges. And third, last, not least at all, is a Trans-Regional Virtual Research Institute, TVRI, and this workshop is one of the activities of the TVRI. So the idea of the TVRI is just imagine an institute, a research institute on a college campus, and just make it virtual and trans-regional and existing more in meetings and in cyberspace than in a building and a seminar room. And Gobin has been involved from the very beginning of conceptualizing what this TVRI would be about, what activities it would comprise, and with refining the theme. We wanted the theme to be on media from the very beginning because we knew from the conferences and even from the postdoc fellowships that this was an area in which there was a great deal of interest, but in which the scholarship was not really as strong as we would want it to be. And so, and where the interdisciplinary issues were particularly, I think, you could see the challenges quite clearly. And so we knew we wanted it to be on media, but it was Gobin and 3 colleagues who came together and discussed and refined sort of the intellectual agenda and decided on 3 meetings. This is the second of the 3. The first was held at NYU in April, and the third will be in Delhi in October. So I will stop there. We love at the SSRC to talk about structures and things like that, but I know not everyone shares our, our love of this kind of thing. But I wanted you to know that this is not a one-off workshop. This is part of a project we're calling the TVRI, which focuses on media activism and the new political. It's part of a broader program which tries to focus scholarly energies and resources into Inter-Asia. And I would just like to thank our 2 main funders, Carnegie Corporation of New York and the Mellon Foundation, which have been funding all of this since 2008 or so. Thank you.
So I think I'll be brief. I was going to say a few words about today's workshop, but I think the program is clear enough, and I don't have to go into a lot of details about the workshop program, just except to say that the theme of media activism happens to be also one of the hot themes now. We have a lot of buzz about media activism here at the Annenberg School. We have another symposium coming up in December, which is on the same theme. It's also called media activism, but not limited to Asia. It's more sort of broadly conceived. And then we have a seminar now, graduate seminar going on media and social movements, which I am co-teaching with two other colleagues. Victor Picard is here, who is also one of the faculty working in this area. So I really just take a few minutes to make sort of Oscar winners kind of speech. Just like to thank, first of all, the Inter-Asia program of the SSRC Council for inaugurating the project of media and the new political in Inter-Asia, of which this conference is one part. And it started 2 years ago, so I was very honored to be invited to join that program. Special thanks to Dr. Sri Rupa Roy of the University of Göttingen in Germany, who couldn't make it today. And of course, to Setni Sharmi and to Holly Denzeisen of the SSRC Council, who are the real force behind this project. Not all the project participants are here today, but I want to give my special thanks to everyone who is able to make it travel from near and far to today's workshop. I would also like, of course, to thank our Dean, Michael, for the strong support that he gave to this kind of endeavor, very strong and enthusiastic. Although my good colleague Ma Wong Kredi is on leave, but he will be on Skype. He and his PARC project also pledged support of the workshop as co-sponsor, as did the Department of Sociology. And David, now you are the representative from Sociology today, who will be moderating.
And you.
Me too, and who will be moderating the last panel of today. The workshop would not have been possible without the hard work of our Annenberg staff, and I wish I could acknowledge everyone, but I want to give my special thanks to Deborah Williams. Deborah is not here, and Marina Krokorian, who is not here either, is who did all the hard work of organizing on the ground and coordinated with Holly of SSRC to make this possible. Holly travels a lot on her job, but always stays ahead of our really multi-channel communication, and I want to thank you for that. So all this, I think, makes really today's event really about connections and interconnections, very appropriate for the theme of the event. I want to thank you, everybody, for being here, and I hope you enjoy today's event. So thank you. We saved a little bit of time, and we'll start our panel early. So we'll start the first panel, and if the panelists could move to the front desk.
First speaker. Yes, Marwan will be joining us by Skype, so this empty chair represents him. Okay, well, is this, yeah. So Goben told me we had to move into a bigger room, so that's very exciting that there was quite a bit of interest in this workshop, and I'm pleased to be chairing the first session, which is entitled Visual Narratives and Corporeal, I don't know how to pronounce that, corporeal. Sorry, I should say I'm from Jordan, by the way, so the accent, if you're trying to place the accent, symbols. We have 3 speakers, and each one has up to 20 minutes. And I think we just start straight off with. So our first paper is by Radha Hegde from New York University, and it's entitled "Sexual Violence, Distributed Outrage, and the Visuality of Protest in India." So, please.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. My thanks to Gobind and Setne and Holly and the other organizers at SSRC for this invitation to participate and the amazing assistance that you have provided. My focus today is on the protests that followed the gang rape of a young woman in India in 2012. The violence put India right at the center of global media attention and as the worst place to be alive as a woman. My discussion today is about the visual production of dissent, its remediated circulations, and the technologies of public assembly that distinguished this protest. The rape and death of Jyoti Singh Pandey created a common platform for public dialogue and a civic imaginary for Indian citizens to mobilize around violence, gender, and public space. I used the distributed outrage to highlight the use of emblematic images and speak to the limits and possibilities of this highly sensational protest in articulating a feminist politics of vulnerability. This incident, I'm sure you all know about it, gruesome as it was, gained media attention in ways that other acts of violence against women have not. The particular conjuncture of issues and their symbolic import struck a nerve in globalizing India. On December 16, 2012, a physiotherapy intern, Jyoti Singh Pandey, accompanied by a male friend, a computer programmer, boarded a private bus in Delhi after watching the film The Life of Pi in one of New Delhi's glitzy urban malls. Each of these details that I kind of highlighted became key signifiers as they permeated public discourse. The bus driver and 3 others on the bus attacked the couple, severely wounding the friend and repeatedly raped Jyoti. The couple was later thrown out of the bus on a side of a highway in Delhi. Jyoti Singh Pandey was in critical condition, was flown by the Indian government to Singapore for treatment, where she then died in a hospital from massive internal injuries. Now, in the capital, the rape and death of this 23-year-old brought protesters to their feet almost immediately. The country was the ideological battleground, seething angrily about the reasons for sexual violence. With a tone of condescension, several global media outlets called attention to the primal violence innate in Indian men. The spectacle of violence became iconic of a malfunctioning India, one with such a mindset that it could not cut it in the global club. Politicians at home attributed the violence to a globalizing India, where women dress provocatively and traditional values have been overrun. The old and new India theory has become a formulaic response to gender issues. So sexual politics is inserted into figurations of modernity, even as violence is culturalized. But enough is enough. This has become the rallying call for a mass showing of public outrage. In impassioned protests, marches, and sit-ins, there has been a clear message that the public at large were fed up with the status quo. Citizens gathered around historic buildings and monuments in Delhi, and in an impressive show of solidarity and collective action, put the subject of sexual violence on the national agenda. The protests spread from key sites in Delhi to other parts of the capital, and soon to other cities in India, summoning social media and mobile technologies. A forceful and loud discourse about gender justice had been set into motion. Posters, slogans, graffiti, street art appeared on the urban landscape, reclaiming space for women. The visual language of protest introduced a range of issues, setting both the agenda and the motivational basis for public assembly. The posters, which popped up as street art in Delhi. You can see the extent of the posters in the bottom picture, were mostly in English, but also in Hindi and later in other languages, mostly handwritten with snappy captions. We want freedom, not feardom. Do not touch me, my dress is not a yes. Still waiting to live. Even many saying, hang the rapists, or rapists are like cancer, etc. A grassroots anti-rape campaign was in full swing in the days and weeks after the incident. The visual culture of protest played a pivotal role in creating spaces of political dialogue. The visual material produced by activists, photographs of the protest, and images of ephemeral texts like graffiti and other street art have now become the shared archive of the campaign against violence. As symbolic resources, the images both disseminate and carry forward the contestation by providing a narrative structure and a coherence for contestations on the ground. The protest posters and public art highlighted the alternative logic and the scripts for transformation of everyday life. In short, they served as the collective gaze of the polity, the civil imaginary that is drawn in contradistinction to hegemonic registers. The performative and political culture of protest, enmeshed within the visual space, highlighted women's vulnerability to violence in public life. The gang rape in India became the catalyst, and a visual field provided a point of access to speak to the chronic exposure of risk faced by women. Operating in and out of a complex media ecology, the visual space destabilized assumptions about the intersections of citizenship, gender, and public space. The tipping point about gender violence had been reached. The most common pools of images about the Delhi protest are the images of processions, policemen using batons and tear gas to disperse protesters, and a large number of protesters carrying signs calling out for justice in creative, innovative ways. Men and women across India took to the streets, speaking what Ariella Azoulay terms the language of revolution, and refusing the role of a passive bystander to violence and the callousness of the state. When the crowds gathered at iconic spots around the city, the political agenda was clear. I do perhaps romanticize it a little bit, only to deconstruct it later. Justice had to be served for the atrocity committed to Jyoti's body, but also other systemic issues concerning gender discrimination entered the conversation, or did it? The seething crowd of protesters demanding action transformed the august spaces of the city. The famed India Gate that you see above, a colonial monument for Indians who served in World War I, the Rashtrapati Bhavan, the residence of India's president with its imposing architecture, the Jantar Mantar, how do you use this? The Jantar Mantar, an 18th century observatory, were the chosen sites of protest. After the rape, the presidential space became, in fact, a site of confrontation. Two forces coming to battle, the state versus the public. The images have become emblematic of the protests in India. Water cannons being directed towards the crowd, men and women from different age groups. There does not appear to be any running away, and there is even a poster that is revealed which says something about safety has become just a word. And here, here is an iconic image of the protest. A woman fearlessly marching through, a woman fearlessly marching on through the water cannon with India Gate rising in the background. Another below who bravely shields her male companion and seems to be saying something to the police, even as a little girl on the right is inducted into the realm of the political. Save my dignity, I am your daughter. The powerful symbolism here is of the Indian mythological woman warrior, determined to fight their status as injured citizens. Although the violence in women's lives continues on many different levels, the struggles for recognition remains an ongoing process. But the vulnerability assumes spectacular visibility only around extreme acts of violence. This type of crisis spotlighting of violence is no doubt related to the logics and limits of mediated attention, which has become the norm of our engagement with the social world. These photographs capture not just women, but the polity at large, refusing a status quo, a state where their bodies can be expended and unprotected by the law. Here we see bodies using public space as a prop for their statement and action. The massive demonstrations, as Judith Butler argues, not only produce a space of appearance, they seize upon already established spaces permeated by existing power, seeking to sever relations between public space, the public square, and the existing regime. In the Delhi case, the gang rape was precisely about the inability of women to be safe in public spaces, exemplifying the state's neglect of its citizens, especially women. One should mention here that the woman was raped in a private transportation bus, an indication of the rapid privatization and that more services in the global city are privatized and hence less public accountability. The words and visuals represent the symbolic center of this protest, steering its political focus and collective energy. Since the Indian Penal Code prohibits the naming of victims of sexual violence, the raped women remain nameless, faceless, imageless. The media, interestingly and ironically, named her variously as Nirbhaya, the fearless one, Amanat, the treasure, Damini, a streak of lightning, also the courageous heroine of a Bollywood classic, Delhi's Braveheart. In protest sites, the nameless, faceless victim was memorialized with candles, which have again become a very interesting point of discussion about symbolic memorialization. In the public consciousness, she became a martyr, and her death was the shame of the nation, the tipping point to claim public space, about the freedom to dress, the freedom to reclaim space, to dress as one is free to choose without being told that one is being provocative. I'm sorry. The death of Jyoti Singh was seen as India's shame and the degradation of the nation. Through all these posters, you see the neoliberal lingo of ownership of my body, my city, my rights, my space. One image that carried a great symbolic weight and circulated on social media sites was this one, of a woman subject to great violence, wrapped in a ripped national flag. The nation as woman and the woman as nation stands violated, and only a new collectivity can save her. The representation of the woman question in nationalism is a complex one for post-colonial societies like India, where the struggle against colonial domination, nationalists view the material domain as the domain of the West, colonial powers, was the external world, while the spiritual world of the inside, which carried the authentic spirit of the nation and its distinctive essence, was symbolized by, in gender terms, as the woman. The imagery of the nation as woman, therefore, is deeply etched in the national imaginary and surfaces today in the cultural debates about globalization and westernization. Hence, the responses from the old guard in India saying that westernization and urbanization and globalization have led to an erosion of values and in turn leads to sexual crime. The posters, the pamphlets, and graffiti constituted the narrative flow of the protest for justice. Almost instantaneously, these media ephemera, as I like to call them, found a home on social media and a floating archive that moves on and takes the messages transnationally. As they move from material urban spaces to online ones, the visual expressions become semiotic resources for a larger audience to understand the ideological direction of the protest, and the activism takes a digital afterlife in these remediated avatars. So headlines around the world noted that the social media scene was super active and produced the protests and distributed the outrage in India about the gang rape. In fact, the New York Times repeatedly stated that the country's young social network savvy population sprang into action, organized the advertising, candlelight vigils, and marches ranging from Cochin, Kerala, to India's outsourcing headquarters of Bangalore, Mumbai's Juhu Beach. So it was very interesting how the computer industry is inserted into the coverage of the rape, which probably is, very soon. On Google Trends Search Volume Index, Delhi gang rape in India were the top search phrases, and media commentators immediately compared Delhi to Tahrir Square and even Tiananmen Square. There's a tendency to conflate various protests. Tahrir, Gezi, Occupy, and Delhi have all kind of conflated, but maybe have some commonalities, but the material particularities of each are flattened out. The value of social media lies precisely in facilitating a choreography of assembly. The physical gathering of people, almost by definition, requires technical coordination. In Delhi, social media was used in full force to get citizens to show up. Something was clearly happening in the digital world and on the streets in Delhi, which, although were not the same, were clearly energizing one another. The internet as not a sequestered site, but one that is an additional area to reclaim public space. As expected, the protests soon veered away in the direction of the playful, in the idiom of the global popular, with calls for people to keep on liking, sharing, dancing, singing, and continue to be brave and beautiful. Of course, the flash mobs dancing for gender justice in malls, young celebrities like the one here doing sarcastic skits on violence went viral. These neoliberal calls to remain brave and beautiful are an interesting display of the new post-feminist turn in India, where consumption is participation and violence itself is a brand enabler. The Delhi protests, through their liquid organizing, revealed the cellular and horizontal structures through which protest publics are increasingly being formed. The bottom line, as many commented, was that there was indeed a massive circulation of discourse about women and a loud interruption. As we watch these eruptions take place in India, there have been others in the past. I think Ashwin will speak to one later. The Pink Chaddi campaign, for example, was short-lived but dramatic. These expressions of protest and indignation build on older forms of feminist protest, yet are distinct in their framings and remain enmeshed within the newer mediated logics of neoliberal capital. The people's protest had no doubt been debated within India and transnationally as being a loud affirmation of feminist politics and bemoaned by others as being a middle-class urban protest. It is true that resistance to other incidents have been much smaller and muted in recent years. One can only posit that it was a particular conjunction of media strategizing, transnational circuits of a digitally connected middle class that raised the level of anger about this particular urban tragedy. 2 minutes. Protests around gender violence are not new in India. There's a very long history of feminist activism, which has historically been shaped by a critique of colonialism, the post-colonial state, patriarchal assumptions, and labor. The articulation of issues in collective terms were distinctly different from the more individualistic playfulness of the current posters and other art that I've shared with you. The feminist call to politicize the personal was intended to open up new spaces of political action. And it has, of course, become, which I can't go into now, a dangerous liaison with neoliberalism, as scholars have called it. The anti-rape campaign was a tipping point that revealed a visible transformation of gender politics. Mediatized logics of organization and visibility were central to the assembly. These logics underwrite how issues of justice were framed, Symbols were mobilized in the neoliberal context. With 80 million internet users and personal computers, 57 million on social media, there's a sizable digital community of the urban middle class in India. The consumer class is indeed being watched very closely. Social media users in India reported that the digital expressions of protest enable them to circumvent old ways of doing feminist politics. The protests were hailed as a result of a new culture of entrepreneurial organizing. The visuals and the art that emerged exemplify the ways in which the middle class demanded a reformulation of gender justice. There have been other incidents of rape that have been highlighted in the global media, but have been much more muted in terms of response than this particular one and the particular assemblage of factors that it represented. The protests constituted a sort of disparate aggregation of people who coalesced temporarily under one incident of violence. Yet the symbolic visibility that this visual culture created for gender justice was historic. While the global media harped on about the backwardness of India's regressive mindset, the protesters in India and in cities made gender issue the #1 trending issue worldwide. Of course, we cannot celebrate this immediately or dismiss it either. These outbursts and flash organizing are part of a paradigmatic shift that are taking place in the writing of feminist politics of the present, its mediated articulations in India and worldwide. Enough is enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Radha. I suggest we move on to Wajma's paper and then have a discussion of the two papers together before Marwan comes on board. So, and I think there will be some, at least, if not a lot of overlap between the two papers or common themes in any case. So next speaker is Wajma Osman from Temple University. Wajma is also a postdoctoral fellow of the Inter-Asia program that I mentioned. So she's here in a double capacity. So.
What happened? Okay. I want to thank Gobin Yang for organizing this, and a few other people. Even though I'm a little bit behind, my presentation's a little long, but I think it's important to do these thank yous. I want to thank Radha Hegde, who's my dissertation advisor, and this work, as you'll see, has some similarities to Radha and is indebted to her because ever since I took her gender and globalization class many, many years ago now, it started a trajectory of thinking about these issues. And the paper I'm presenting now is actually stems from my master's thesis, which is about gender politics in Afghanistan, so not my dissertation work. However, the analysis of the four Malalais that I'm going to do later on in the presentation is new analysis. So I'm tapping into some past archives and bringing in some new analysis. And I also want to take a second or a minute to thank Setni and Holly. You know, they both, their professionalism is amazing, and their academic expertise, and they've really helped me, and I think many other people, think outside of just the boundedness of area-specific studies. So thanks to them, the SSRC supported both my dissertation research, and I'm a postdoc with them as well. My research moved from just thinking about Afghanistan to thinking about the neighboring countries, to comparing and doing analysis outside to other regions too. So thank you both for that. Okay, so on to my presentation. The 20th century has often been described as the age of pictures, a phrase that Walter Benjamin first coined. While writing and print dominated and continues to for many centuries with the advent of mechanical reproduction, image technologies, visual culture proliferated to new incredible proportions. Enter digital imagery and digital reproduction, and the reproductions exponentially grew from there. In the grand scheme of things, this is what W.J.T. Mitchell calls the pictorial turn. And as such, we need to have more modes of analysis and methods to really think about this phenomenon, which is relatively recent. So in this brief history of media studies, which is what my PhD is in, researchers, in order to understand the effects of media and representations, have to either do audience or reception studies or production studies in which you either analyze the motivations of producers or try to understand how audiences decode and interpret images. And my own work well, initially was more of a classic production study of media production in Afghanistan and then beyond Afghanistan as well. So enter W.J.T. Mitchell, who with his book, What Do Pictures Want?, radically shifts the analytical lens. Now the question isn't about producers and receivers or audiences as much as it is, what do pictures themselves want? As critics have pointed out, we cannot methodologically engage with pictures the way we can with human beings. So why be excited by the prospects of metaphorically ascribing a picture with a subject position and therefore agency, as Mitchell would like us to do, when it clearly presents an analytical quagmire? Because there is something about visual texts that evades and escapes being studied rationally and scientifically, stemming from the monotheistic religions, or what we call the people of the book. There is a hierarchy in which print culture is esteemed and icons and visuals are devalued and feared, stemming from the second commandment. And Mitchell also talks about Said's humanism as well as Vico and how they thought as well that pictures presented an obstacle to rational debate, but I don't have time to get into that right now. But given our genealogical baggage and fears associated with the irrationality of images, the perspectorial shift away from social science empirical methods in anthropomorphizing inanimate images are astoundingly liberating and revealing. While Heidegger is concerned with how we use pictures as a tool for achieving mastery of the world, for Mitchell it is the pictures that try to master the world that are worthy of studying. In our classic binaries, it is the good turned bad, the slave turned master, the dead turned living that interests him. The iconic, the spectacular images, those that have become media spectacles, are the most powerful and vociferous and seem most worthy of animating and studying because they have already been animated. Sure, all pictures have excess meaning or surplus value that seep out or leak out of the frames that their makers or masters attempt to confine them in. And this is a sentiment that many scholars have explored in depth, yet it is the iconic images larger than life that attempt to be totalizing in their meaning, to try as much as any images can to evade being read in multiple ways. Their dominant message and or meaning has been coded in such a way as to disable negotiated or resistive readings. They are in sharp contrast to the erratic arts or some pop artists who intentionally play with the flickering of readings. Mitchell explains how the Twin Towers, became the ultimate symbols of modernity, capitalism, and globalization. Therefore, the very publicly staged what he calls creative destruction of the World Trade Center was to create a new ultimate symbology, that of anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, anti-globalization, anti-modernity. Mitchell also briefly mentions the Buddhas of Bamyan as part of his discussion of the Second Commandment's disdain for idolatry. Quote, As an icon of modern capitalism, the towers were seen by Islamic fundamentalists as no less an idol than the Buddhist monuments destroyed by the Taliban in Afghanistan in spring of 2001. Yet there is a missing link between the iconography of September 11th attacks and the destruction of the Buddhas of Bamyan that he doesn't mention, but I'm going to talk about it, and I think it's a key factor in the equation. The thing that connects the two historical events and is a set of powerful iconography in its own right is Afghan women. Calling on a lexicon of imagery from the era of colonialism, the saving of Afghan women was used as a justification to start a military assault on the Taliban, specifically in Afghanistan more generally. Since the events of 9/11 and the start of the war on terror, Afghan women have come under the Western spotlight in popular culture, evident in the proliferation of media such as fiction films, television programs, documentaries, books, news reports that focus on their plight under repressive Islamic regimes. These were some of the topics I studied in my thesis, were films from Osama to Kandahar to a slew of films that came out with titles like Behind the Veil, Beneath the Veil, Beyond the Veil, things like that. And as Ella Shohat and Bob Stam explained, this falls into the classic trope of the rape and rescue narratives. These media have been embraced by the mainstream and critiqued by others, especially some scholars such as Laila Boulagad, Charles Hershkin, Saba Mahmoud, among others, who are concerned with the overwhelming portrayal of women as victims without accounting for their actual or potential agency. Building on the work of these scholars, I have argued that through a complex process of spectacling, Afghan women have become Afghan women, in quotes I put that, a singular passive entity that conforms to stereotypes of women under Islam, which have gained new currency since 9/11. Instead of giving Afghan women a podium from which to speak, this double-crossing discourse took what was left of Afghan women's agency in order to aggrandize the power of so-called expert individuals and organizations, both governmental and non-governmental. The reason why Afghan women as a body of imagery is an integral part of the 9/11 iconographic equation is that it enabled the dialogue to continue in line with the rhetoric of masculinist protection, which is a term that Marion Young uses, to attack the Taliban and Osama Bin Laden without the pretext of saving the women of Afghanistan from their brethren would have been even less popular, especially with the left and intellectuals. In this continuum of events, so let me actually just show a few before I go there. So this was one of the first operations after 9/11. It was first Operation Anaconda, then Operation Enduring Freedom, and so forth. In this continuum of events, it is very tempting to imagine a set of rebellious pictures running rampant. In the case of the World Trade Center and the Buddhas of Bamyan, the revolt of the images destroyed their subject violently with jet fuel and dynamite respectively. In the case of Afghan women, they destroyed the very people they were supposed to represent metaphorically. Instead of giving them a podium to speak from, they took what was left of Afghan women's agency. So while Afghan women as a body of imagery proliferated and circulated widely, they made their subject matter a hollowed out empty signifier. This silent overexposure actually made Afghan women a joke, a caricature that was mocked and ridiculed in satirical exposés, in magazines, in videos, in genres ranging from comedy to pornography. And I have a few of these examples, but I don't have all my slides. So these are just some of the images. So these are some of the things I've seen. It's also important to note that even some transnational feminist and/or anti-war organizations that sought to help contributed to the beating of the war drum. Due to their lack of cultural access, they directed their attention to and gathered their information from the few websites of Afghan women's organizations or women's rights movement that were available in English. Western feminist groups predominantly cited and showcased the work of RAWA, which is a Revolutionary Association of Women in Afghanistan. And I don't have time to get into detail about them. I've written about them before, but they're one group out of many in Afghanistan. They also happen to be contentious for a variety of reasons. But groups such as, and I'll give you a little bit of an example from my own experiences with them, but groups such as New Yorkers Say No to War, as well as Eve Ensler's V-Day Foundation, were instrumental in bringing them to the U.S. on national tours, as well as arranging press meetings with people with different media outlets. And I remember post 9/11, I was involved with New Yorkers Say No to War, and they were bringing in different representatives of RAWA from Afghanistan, and the representative went before a large crowd of people. This was in Chelsea in New York, and she went on and on to talk about how she's been extremely victimized and has had this very tragic life, and has been abused by her father and brothers and on, and generalized that this is the case for all women and girls in Afghanistan. And so, and the audience, who was actually, some very prominent people in New York at the time. So there was celebrities, there was Rosie Perez, there was famous, well-known journalists, and other people were really eating up what she was saying. And so there was academics as well. I spoke out and said, this is not the case with my family and other people I know as well. It's not that every single person is subjected to these kinds of misogynist conditions. And immediately I was shut down. And they said, sit down. I was booed. I was jeered. This is back in 2001. And one of the people was an academic who wrote the first book on RAWA, the heroine who started RAWA. Her name is Mina. And I was thinking to myself, if Mina herself was there, this whole exchange would have made her, it was the antithesis of who she was, because she herself came out of the Afghan women's rights movement, and the idea of this type of victimhood would not have gelled with her own political beliefs. But that's just an example of how the transnational activists, along with certain women's groups within Afghanistan, perpetuated the beating of the war drum as well.
5 minutes.
Oh, okay. So I'm really behind. All right. So I'll skip over some things because I really want to get to the Malalais. So I apply some of Mitchell's theories to how he says that the images, they become this powerful collective, they have this powerful collective desire for death and violence. And so that Osama bin Laden had to be killed because the imagery of smoke them out of their caves and all these types of things. So even 10 years, a decade afterwards, that had to happen. And how from Barack Obama to all the other people during the presidential elections, they kept on saying, we'll go after them and we'll get them, until that happened. And that this had become, from malls to everywhere, you would see this type of imagery. And it had the psychoanalytical promise of going into these exotic dark caves. Okay, so let me see. Let's just get to... Yeah, and I also just wanted to point out that while I think his method, as much as we can call it a method, is useful, it's important to note that it has to be used with caution because of the fact that it really lacks a political economy analysis, because these images didn't aggrandize of their own making, and it's really important to make visible the hand of the makers and follow the trail, or what's called the media commodity trail, of how they have become as powerful as they have, especially I'm talking about the images before this, and that's where I think is one of my big criticisms of his method is is that it doesn't follow, make the connections between how there's a huge PR industry combined with military apparatus, and how to use the Althuserian term, the ideological state apparatus goes along with the repressive state apparatus through this Hearts and Minds campaign that they projected. Okay, so moving on quickly. So this is, most of you probably know Malala Yousafzai, the most famous of the Malalais, and she was shot or attempted to be killed by the Taliban in 2008. And this is Malalai Joya, who's actually a good friend of mine. I assume many people don't know her here, but she was a parliamentarian from the Farah province in Afghanistan, and she spoke out against the warlords, who most of them have somehow managed their way into the parliament. And she said what most Afghans commonly talk about, which is that they're war criminals and that they should be tried, they should not be in politics. She was subsequently banned and permanently removed from the parliament. And there's been numerous films made about her, Enemies of Happiness amongst others, that have done extremely well in the film festival circuits. In Sundance, it won the World Cinema Award. At IDF, they won another award. And so she's relatively well, I mean, they're all extremely well known in Afghanistan, but she's not quite as much here. This is one of her books. This is another one of her books that she wrote. This is Malalai Kakar, who was killed by the Taliban. She was a police officer. Her title was Lieutenant Colonel in Kandahar, which is a even more conservative province in the Farah province. And she was killed in 2007. But she... there was a documentary that was subsequently made about her, but her documentary didn't do as well internationally or in the film festival markets. I also had met her, and she's a very impressive person, extremely well known in Afghanistan, barely a blip here. She worked for the women's division of the Kandahar Police Department. And this is an image of her that a photographer took, who's extremely upset because a conservative right-leaning British organization called Britain First, I looked at their website recently, it's horrific, have used it to make another type of ad to ban the burqa. Once again, Malalai herself would not be happy about this. Not that she was a supporter of the burqa, but because of the fact that they're extremely right group, and also an Australian MP has been using this as well for her campaign, who's on the extreme right. And then this is the last Malalai, who's the Malalai of Maiwand, who in the Second Anglo-Afghan War, during a crucial point in the Battle of Maiwand, when the Afghan army was retreating, marched first ahead of the troops into battle and was killed. And the school I went to in Afghanistan as a child was named after her. She's extremely famous in Afghanistan too. And surprisingly, or not so surprisingly, she doesn't show up in the fastidious British archives at all. And so the Afghans won that battle, a crucial battle in the Second Anglo-Afghan War. Since I have, no time. What is it? 1 minute, okay, so which is not much. I just want to say, I had a few different questions and comments I wanted to pose, but I'll ask one of them, which is, why is it that out of these 4 Malalais who all have who have a very high status in Afghanistan, one of them has reached this global audience? And I think the reason is because the rest of them don't fall into neat imperial agendas or icons, meaning that Malalai Joya, who's equally who equally challenges the conservatives in Afghanistan, is also very critical of the U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan. She is from the Farah province, as I said, and Farah has been subjected to, it's one of the most drone-attacked places in Afghanistan. So one of the organizations, and like I said, she's a close friend of mine. We tried to bring her in. I worked with a few different anti-war groups and other groups in New York. We tried to bring her in for her book tour, and the U.S. State Department denied her visa repeatedly. And so we launched a public campaign until she was finally brought in. So same thing with Malalai Kakar and Malalai of Maiwan. They don't fall into quite the same kind of agendas. And she, who is, photogenic, young girl of 17 now, has captured the imagination in a different way, although to her credit, she's recently been becoming more outspoken as well. So I'll leave it there, and hopefully we'll have time to talk about other stuff later.
Thank you.
I had some other images of Google Trends, but.
All right, great. No, I think we do have time to have some discussion. So I open up the floor. We can take 15 minutes to 20 minutes, perhaps. When is Marwan coming on?
Marwan is standing by.
Standing by, okay. So 10 minutes? 10 minutes, okay.
After Marwan's, we can have a little
More discussion, okay. All right, back there.
So this is a question for Roger. I certainly have questions for you too. But, what difference does the new government make in terms of the manipulation or arrangement of these images of rape and women? So here's a government that has a stake in changing the image of India in the world. What signs do you see that that kind of reshaping takes place, and how it will affect the subject of your talk?
I'll speak to it in terms of the images that I showed you right now. One should realize that I tried to actually collect much of the graffiti, and they had disappeared, mainly because of timing. Soon after this was the election fever happened. So that was one. The second is the interesting ways in which Modi's speech, even I think just last weekend in his interview with on CNN, yes, he talked about women, the dark mindset, the black hole about women is always brought up. And of course, he also brought it up in his acceptance speech. I can't quite remember, but it's about we should get women back into get the state of respect within their families. So it's a very interesting way of saving women, but putting them back into the privatized kind of spheres. He does say it, his first campaign was about the girl child, empowering women. But this language of empowerment also is really problematic, so one has to kind of wait and see. But from the latest that I heard, that it was the language of putting them back into a position of dignity and space, which as a feminist is quite problematic.
Question for Raka. I thought really fascinating discussion about the neoliberal part of the story, especially how violence could become a means of branding, right? I wonder whether you could say a little bit more about that kind of practices of liberalism, neoliberalism, trying to co-opt this kind of activism.
Right, as a feminist scholar and an activist, I should position myself that it's very easy to say that, this is the new stuff, and, we used to think about activism in more sustained ways. So there's a big difference between that sustained activism to the protest, immediate sensational protest. The reason why I brought that up, which very briefly, is violence becoming used as a brand, is because of course, the IT sector, right, went into high gear, developing apps and all kinds of things. With even now, if you put the word Nirbhaya, you see apps, you see GPS, you see all kinds of gizmos and gadgets about safety. So it's that was at the back of my mind, and of course the kind of flash mobs, dancing. using all the buzzwords, using patriarchy, using freedom, and so on, but in these very post-feminist, mall feminist, and it's not lipstick feminism anymore, it's like a mall feminism, you know, it comes and goes. But it was those gizmos and as the sort of savior of the moment that instigated that comment.
Thank you very much for the presentations. Wasma, I had a question about the narrative around the assassination of Bin Laden. I think it can fit well with your thesis. I don't know if you've looked at it, but the early reports about him hiding behind one of his wives when the team kind of went into there, and then I guess the administration eventually backed off that. But have you looked at that narrative around that?
No, I haven't, yeah.
It seems to fit nicely with the overarching sort of argument that you're making.
Yeah, thank you. No, I'll definitely look at that.
Back to you.
So I have a question for, which is, could you do more in linking the first part of your talk about the power of images and the surplus value of images, it's sort of a notion that they're different from words in terms of the way they should be considered in the political economy. How to link that to the second part of your talk on which image is chosen and the regulation of images in some way.
I mean, I think what I was trying to show, and I wasn't able to get to all of my points, was that the first set of images, including the extreme interpolation of Afghan culture as static and backwards and traditional and all of that, was accomplished through, you know, billion-dollar industry, which includes PR and the U.S. military and people I actually interviewed as part of my dissertation research. They're very clear about their objectives to win hearts and minds and spend money on these media campaigns. And so the second set of images with the four Malalais, and like I said, I didn't quite get to all of my points, but I'm glad you're asking this, is that with those types of images, it's much more difficult if it doesn't fit into the agendas of the imperial powers, right? And so what happens is it's not as top-down, it's more bottom-up. And for it to be bottom-up, it still involves the coordination of filmmakers, you know, international filmmakers, photographers, who put them on the map in the first place. And from there, it crosses over oftentimes to social media. So it isn't just a social media phenomena. The fact that they reached the positions that, especially Malalai Joya's film, in the international film festival circuit, which I've studied, had something to do with her reaching a certain amount of audiences, but not the same amount as Malalai Yousafzai, right? And so I think that was my point with why they haven't, like some of the Malalais haven't reached the same level of access to the global public sphere, if we want to call it that, the way Malalai Yousafzai has.
Yeah, I think from both the presentations, it's quite evident that tremendous amounts of creativity is needed to, you know, mobilize people through visualization. But I'm curious because right now we have, you know, of course, as you both point out, there's a tremendous history to, you know, women using these very non-digital forms of engagement. And how are they relating with groups that are online that may or may not be actually participating at the ground level, but often they could dominate the media sphere and also manipulate or change the narrative, right? So whether it's a rape or, you know, in your context, both contexts, it would be very interesting to see, are they on board, or often are images which go viral online are being imposed upon grassroots activism, and how have you actually, you know, sort of examined that?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, one of my evolving projects is to interview activists, you know. The first answer I could give you is that there is a tremendous amount of tension. For example, in the rape crisis, there's a woman by the name of Kavita Krishnan who is extremely critical of this type of newfangled organizations, and she really puts in a very political economic analysis of, No, it's a bit, she calls herself an old guard feminist, So there is that sort of tension. And I think it's not a tension specific to India, it's a tension within the feminist movement of theorists, activists of an older saying that there is a more systemic explanation than this immediacy, the immediacy of mediated organizing. So there is that tension, but I personally believe that one cannot either dismiss it or celebrate it. This is the reality, and one needs to see how this can be shaped, in fact. But it's a much longer discussion. Thank you.
And I'll just briefly add that with one of the slides I showed with the case of Malalai Kakar, the images of her that this Dutch photographer had taken as part of a film she had made about her, the one with her in the burqa and the gun, being used by right-wing groups in Australia and in Britain is something that I'm sure if she was alive today, she would have found horrific. I mean, I looked up their websites and they're xenophobic, racist groups, and so how these images circulate, and the woman herself, the photographer, is suing them because that's not how she wanted that image to be used. And so the question of how images go viral, I think, is a really important one. And to my mind, oftentimes it seems that even at times where we think it's a grassroots movement, it might not necessarily, I mean, in certain ways it is grassroots, but there's massive amounts of organization and capital that goes into making things that seem viral and popularly supported, which might not necessarily be.
Take a last question. It'll have to be short and short responses, but please.
The question is for Rana. So in Prime Minister Modi's interview on CNN with Fareed Zakaria this weekend, Zakaria asked him over and over again different versions of the same question, which were, how is India like China? And he was very hesitant, and he was...
The woman question, I missed you.
Oh, I see.
He kept rephrasing what?
No, Zakaria kept asking the Prime Minister questions about India in the context of China's population growth, rise to economic power, and Modi was very aggressively sort of pushed back against that line of questioning. Arguing, India is not China, India is India, arguing for the specificity of the Indian context. But clearly, as you showed us so beautifully, many of the images of the protests, particularly the striking photograph of the woman in the sort of engulfed in the fire hoses. Clearly, these images are being globally
circulated,
diffused throughout the world. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about whether or not these activist movements have linked up with other movements of global feminism around the world, and particularly I'm thinking about the Indian diaspora, particularly in the United States, and then how the proliferation and the diffusion of those images around the globe can serve as a kind of bridge between local or regional social movements and more global mobilization efforts.
I have no idea how I'd answer that in a second, but two things. I am actually one of the founder members of Manavi, which is the very first feminist organization in the diaspora. And so once again, to Pyle's thing, it is an old and new thing. It's there has been some amount of making a statement and so on. But however, femen. The naked feminist, as they're called, I had some images of that. There have been stray examples of a few lawyers, streaking in the middle of Mumbai and so on, which just comes and goes, So, but I think there has, in fact, been a transnational grassroots connection among feminist intellectuals and activists to some extent, but much more of the like, share, sing, and be beautiful variety.
Thank you. So we will come back to you then, to both of you. So
Thank you
how
very
do we
much.
bring Marwan?
Let me try to connect Marwan.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
There
Hi,
it is.
everyone.
Hello, Marwan. This is Satine Shami. We haven't met actually, but we've emailed, so it's a pleasure to meet you virtually. I'm chairing this session, and you've seen the audience. So you have 20 minutes, and followed by a discussion of about 10 minutes or so, where we might bring in the other speakers as well, who spoke before you. So please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I want to say thank you to Gobin for organizing this and including me in it. And I also want to thank you and the Social Science Research Council. And I see Michael is in the audience also. Michael has always been supportive of such interesting projects. What I thought I would do today is, so I'm speaking about the body on Skype, which is already ironic. I'm also losing my voice, and I have a tooth that's falling apart. So I feel very self-conscious. But because I only have 20 minutes or 15 to 20 minutes, what I thought I would do is explain the theoretical foundations of why I'm orienting this book project towards the symbolism of the body in activism and why it is important. So one of the things that we all know about the Arab uprisings is the initial focus on social media, and one of the, I am a skeptic, and one of the first reactions was, well, they need to be operated by somebody. So at a very, very basic instinctive level, I think the body is very important. But the other thing that happened, so I went and spent a couple of years ago, mostly in Beirut, but traveled to Egypt, to Jordan, looking at a lot of the graffiti of the Syrian revolution. And one of the things that I thought was very interesting. So when I look at, I look at the thumbnails of some of my graffiti pictures, and I see how they are dominated by images of the human body. So the primary material in some ways were haunted by bodies that were burning with anger, with defiance, but they were also throbbing with pain and hope. They were violating social taboos. They were violating political red lines. And I can think of several examples, which is really what my PowerPoint consists of, which is a series of pictures. So Gobin, if you don't mind, just running the pictures from beginning to end. So if you look, it began supposedly, as we know the narrative, with Mohammed Bouazizi's self-immolation in Tunisia. We have Khaled Said in Egypt, the famous before and after picture. Here, the body functions as the site of evidence for the brutality of the state, of the police state. We have many pictures of activists having been tortured, beaten. Egypt's Alia al-Mahdi blogging, going naked on her blog, A Rebel's Diary, and what that meant. We have Syrian protesters who, when the government said, you're hiding weapons under your clothes, that's why we're attacking you, they took off their shirts. There's footage of demonstrations in Aleppo with people without shirts to show the body as innocence, basically. If you look at revolutionary humor, you see also body imagery is important. Now, why is it important is the next question. What are the kind of the deep historical, conceptual issue at heart here? Well, we know from history that body metaphor is central to power. It was central to political power in medieval Europe, whether it's Louis XIV then, Bashar al-Assad today. The sovereign's figure is the body of the realm. I mean, that's how we describe it, right? And so we have people, theorists like Ernst Kantorowicz, who have studied this. Kantorowicz, for instance, in his piece about his famous book about the king's two bodies, he identifies what he calls an organic corporational concept of the body politic. That is central to political theology. In 1518, another theorist talked about the kingdom being like a man. The king is the heart, the people form the other parts. And so if you look, this developed throughout medieval Europe. It found kind of its full embodiment in Elizabethan England, and then kind of blew up in the open during the French Revolution, where we have an opposition between the king's two bodies here, basically, or the sovereign's two bodies, in our case, the dictator's two bodies. Basically, you have what in Latin was called corpus politicum, the political body, which is the body that carries sovereignty, which is the body that's immortal because it is the nation. But you also have the so-called body natural, right? It's the body that gets sick. It's the body that dies. This is where the expression, the king is dead, long live the king really never dies. Now, I think this background is essential to, in my opinion, to understand why the body became such an important symbol. And of course, this is something that I argue, and I have to argue, I don't take it for granted, within the Arab uprisings. So a couple of things I think that are very important. So we know that in recent years, especially in recent years, we've had systematic violations of people's bodily integrity through physical torment, licensed rape, all kinds of inhumane activity. Arab states made torture a widely experienced ordeal by activists. If you talk to activists, this is something that's really a burning issue for them. Having been tortured once is enough to join this club of people who really feel that is a central issue. But also pictures of torture, of brutality. You know, you've seen some of the pictures on my PowerPoint, were extensively circulated through video. And so they help make torture and physical torment a galvanizing issue. We also have, this is not only Arab states, we also have the Abu Ghraib scandal. We have US drone attacks that continue to make news. We have Israeli brutality against the Palestinians. I mean, one of the interesting things about the latest Gaza war is the art, the Palestinian art that came out of it. I don't know if you've seen any of it. A lot of it focuses on the human body. So the body is a galvanizing issue. It haunts activism. It fuels its peculiar aesthetics of what I call insurgent art and culture. Now, of course, if we're going to analyze the body in these terms, especially in the Arab world, we have to contrast it with two images of kind of the Arab Muslim body that circulate in the West. One of them, of course, is a suicide bomber. There's a lot of interesting literature on this, beginning with Mbembe's famous piece on necropolitics, which I can't believe was published more than 10 years ago. It just sounds it feels so current. And also the covered woman as some kind of a sign of foreignness within, especially, this is perhaps more the case in Europe than in North America. But so you have an aggressive, hyper-masculine body, and you have a submissive, hypo-feminine body, so to speak. And so I'd like to position the body as the symbolic importance of the body as somewhere in between. I'd like to think of the kind of the brave activist bodies as fearless but not fearsome. And I think if exploding and concealed bodies epitomize in various ways repudiations of modernity, I think revolutionary dissent in its embodied form augurs nothing short than a very embodied yearning for modernity. Now, so the questions I ask, of course, I ask questions in the book about what do French Revolution pamphlets have to do with the Arab Spring. As I mentioned, there are at least two great books about corporeal metaphor in the French Revolution. So this is not new. It's something that's central to many revolutions. How may previous self-immolations, whether it's the famous Dick Van Dyke in Saigon, 1963, Jan Palach in 1969 Prague, or Malachi Richard in 2006 in Chicago. What do these have in common with Bouazizi's act and 4 or 5 dozen other self-immolations in the Arab world during the uprising? How does the practice of sati in India inform our understanding of self-immolation? How do the role of mosques today echo the role of Black churches in the civil rights South in the United States? How does the aesthetic sensibility of something like Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People help us grasp the women activists who have gone nude for political reasons? So I'm asking a lot of questions and I see a lot of body symbolism coming through also the notion of bread, the notion of dignity, the so-called ideology-free activism of the uprising, and I believe these are very embodied. Now, how do I make sense of all of this in the next 8 minutes or 10 minutes I have left? So one of the things I would like to do, so I established, first of all, a spectrum of activist actions that are embodied. So one of them is, perhaps a basic way to say it, is the body as medium, right? So you can wear a T-shirt that has a political message. You can have a tattoo that has political message. And then we go to higher stakes. So posing naked in Cairo is really engaging in a kind of a higher gambit than wearing a T-shirt that says a political message. And this is, of course, a very complex issue, right? We've had some leading scholars who have written about this. Does the act of Arab women, so when Arab women go naked and write things on their bodies, as you see in these pictures, are they really pandering to Western audiences? Or are they really concerned with the local impact of their act? People like Laila Abu Lughod has written some of the stuff about this, and I think this is also very important. But beyond posing naked, so when you walk naked in a demonstration where you have soldiers at the other end shooting at you, the stakes go up again, right? A hunger strike is basically a slow motion self-immolation. The stakes go up as well. And we go all the way to just pouring gasoline on your body, lighting yourself on fire in a very public space, typically in front of a government building, to send a message. So how do I make sense of all of this? What I did is I've tried to identify two registers, right? One of them is what I call the biopolitical register, and the second is what I call the subversive register. And I'll talk a little more about this in the time I have left. So one of the things that Agamben talks about in Homo Sacer is what he calls the paradox of sovereignty. The paradox of sovereignty is the following: the sovereign in his realm is at once within it and outside of it. He's within it because he rules it, he's part of it, he's the head of the body politic, but he's outside of it also because he can declare anytime he wants the state of exception. The state of exception, to maybe vulgarize it and oversimplify it, is basically the ability to suspend all rules. If sovereignty is at its heart the ability to decide who lives and who dies, suspending all the rules mean you can kill people without justifying it legally, right? And this is, we have the notion of bare life that comes into this. So how does this work in the case of activism? One of the things I argue is that if you look at Arab dictatorships and you use kind of a combination of Kantorovich's King's Two Bodies and Agamben work on biopolitics, one of the things you see is that dictators really absorb the nation state in the symbolism of their own bodies. So for instance, Lisa Wedeen in her book about Assad the father who died, she really reprises Kantorovich and talks about how the cult of the dictator works to personify the state by identifying the mortal body of the leader with the immortal body of the nation. So this is basically Kantorovich in a nutshell. Now, the way the cult of personality works is to enforce obedience by regimenting bodies through the performance of rituals and spectacles, right? And in these rituals and spectacles, the body functions, Wedeen argues after, again, Kantorovich and to some extent Foucault, the body functions not to legitimize power, but to substantiate it. What's the difference between legitimating power and substantiating power? The difference is very simple. Legitimating power meaning attaching it to norms and values that are acceptable within the sovereign realm of the nation. Substantiating power is basically making power tangible. So when you engage in rituals that obey the leader, what you're doing is power is not legitimate, but you're substantiating it. You're giving it substance. You're making it manifest. You're giving it concreteness. You're giving it a substance. So when somebody like Bouazizi self-immolates, and we have the other body acts, what he's really doing is he's desubstantiating power. Because if power is substantiated by people obediently engaging in rituals of power, when you decide, and if sovereignty is ultimately about the right of deciding who lives and who dies, when you kill yourself in a way that flagrantly disobeys not only political power, but in this case, we could talk about religious power. After all, it's again circulated that Islam is against suicide, and I hate to oversimplify the issue so much, but that is the case. And so, in his act, what Bouazizi does is desubstantiating power. So this is the biopolitical register. You have a second register, which I call the subversive register. Right? And these are please feel free to push back. These are just working concepts for the time being. And while the biopolitical register works to desubstantiate power, the subversive register works to delegitimate power. So you see this most clearly in revolutionary political humor, in activist political humor, right? How does political humor work? So one of the chapters in the book looks at how political humor has used animal metaphor, for instance. In Egypt, it's most predominant, but it exists throughout them. So Mubarak was the laughing cow. I think you see one of the pictures of, what does the cow? The cow has many attributes, none of them being noble and positively connected to leadership, right? So this is well known. The jokes circulated about him for 30 years. And this is something that Bakhtin has written about extensively, right? The carnivalesque process of leveling power. And what you do in this subversive register is, instead of desubstantiating power by engaging in a radical act like Bouazizi, you delegitimiate it by chipping at it, by bringing down the dictator or the king from his pedestal to the level of the people. How do you do this? By comparing him to a cow. We also have, in the 1 year that Morsi ruled, for instance, I've gathered a lot of materials where he's been compared to a bear. Mr. Sisi, the defense minister who led the military coup against Morsi and who's ruling Egypt, who's meeting with Mr. Obama today, I believe, in New York, he's trying to, and his people are trying to portray him as the lion. But some people in Egypt have a different idea and are working with the symbology of the donkey. So, I'm looking at this and say, okay, so what does this do? Well, Bakhtin talks about, the lower strata of the body, right? The bodily fluids, the bestiality of the human body, which makes us really very close to animals. So animal symbolism is one way. When you make joke after joke after joke about the leader being like a cow or like a donkey, none of them having positive attributes, that delegitimates their power. Now, so these, if you look at the specific materials I'm examining, the data, so to speak, these two registers and these two processes of desubstantiation and delegitimation work together. So how do they work? I just gave you the example of Egypt. In another chapter, which is really the odd chapter out in the book, since it does not look at activists on the ground, but it looks at celebrity activism in the Arab uprising. So activism by people who are already famous, who already have a lot of social, cultural capital, who already have the megaphone in the public sphere, so to speak. And it works in the same way. So one of the cases that I'm focusing on is the Syrian singer Asala, who threatened on her Facebook, she wrote to the Syrian revolutionary on her Facebook page. She threatened Assad with a song about his throne called, "Oh, if this throne could speak or could tell us what happened, what it would say, blah, blah, blah." So you have a war that followed on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube, in which really body imagery and body symbolism took over after the first few days. And unfortunately, I had to go through all the, hundreds of comments, for instance, on the YouTube video of the promo to the video, because the video itself was never released. And it was all about Asala being portrayed as the renegade limb in the body politic, who has gone rotten and who threatens the head with their rottenness and therefore had to be excised, had to be cut out. It so happens that Asala as a child had polio, and Assad, the father, paid for her medical treatment. I mean, it doesn't get better than this in terms of data, right? So you have all this thing about all supporters of the dictator saying to her, when your body was sick, we fixed you. You were a cripple, and he fixed you. And now that your body is healthy, you rebel against him. Again, all of it was body imagery. The desubstantiation and delegitimation also work in some media forms. So one of the chapters look at finger puppetry, right? What does finger puppetry do? Finger puppetry does something very interesting. It reduces a dictator, in this case, again, it's Bashar al-Assad of Syria. It reduces a dictator whose portraits are the size of 3 stories on buildings to the size of a finger, and gives him a cute name, infantilizes him, make him look tiny, and as a result, desubstantiates power. When you add humor to it, there's also a process of delegitimation going on. So if you want to, I don't have the time, but if you go on YouTube and Google Top Goon, Diary of a Little Dictator, you can have a lot of fun. Most of them are dubbed in, all of them actually are dubbed in English. So even if you look, Sitani, how much time do I have left? Do I have any left?
No.
No. Okay. So the last thing I want to say is, if there's a spatial dimension to all of this, all the slogans are basically work according to the desubstantiation and delegitimation. It's either an inside-outside, so dégage, leave the country, that's inside-outside, or the people want to topple the regime, for instance, is a vertical axis of desubstantiation, or I'm sorry, of delegitimation, where the dictator is brought down on that axis. So I'll stop there. I hope I made sense, and I hope that you'll push back a little. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So we have 20 minutes, which is wonderful. Radha and Wajma, maybe you can come up as well. There may be some questions cross-cutting across the papers. So, yeah, Asfin.
I had a question for
Yes, but
Marwan.
Asfin put his hand up first.
Okay. I'm sorry. Okay. No. Go ahead. I didn't. I thought there was a lull.
That's Radha's voice, right?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
So Marwan can hear us. Yeah.
Yes, so Asfin.
Sorry.
Can we point the camera to you?
So try,
Oh, I see.
do you see him?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Phil, by the way. It is Phil, isn't it?
Phil, who's put it together, yes.
Okay, thank you, yeah.
This question came out of Marwan's presentation, but it goes to both of your presentations as well. The biopolitical and the subversive registers was very useful to think through what you just said, Marwan. But it immediately raised a question for me about how are you trying to think through the very entangled temporalities of those two registers in any given event as it unfolds? Does the subversive, the slow sort of chipping away that you said, that seems to work in the terrain of the everyday, right? Everyday political cartoons, little things like what Radha said, the like-share sort of economy that we have. Whereas the biopolitical one is far more radical. It has a very condensed sort of temporality to it, which then connects up with the daily, slow, continuous time of politics, maybe.
Yeah.
I just want to know how you're thinking through that entanglement of time in these two registers, and maybe that goes to your point, Radha, about the immediacy of these new forms of activism, but there are deep historical slow processes which we're seeing in Calcutta now, where I disagreed with your point about mall feminism, because in Calcutta we're actually seeing it not play out that way. So maybe there's a history of the city's activism that then tempers the mall feminism there, which maybe in Bangalore it just doesn't happen.
So Marwan first, then Radha?
Yeah, so I haven't thought nearly enough as much as I should about this, but and now I will. But one of the, I think the way I would think about it is you have these radical acts, whether they're, so I'm trying to discern between self-immolation of Bouazizi, which you can argue he made that decision, and Khaled Saeed, who got clobbered by the police, right? Now, what these events do, these radical outbursts, so to speak, is number one, they help proliferate images, right? And these kinds of proliferating images. So Bouazizi, for instance, you saw him on handheld signs, on graffiti on the walls. Eventually, now he's on a national postage stamp in Tunisia. There's a square named after him. I believe there's a Bouazizi Avenue in Paris. He won the Sakharov Prize. And so the images begin to proliferate in multiple contexts. And when they do that, what happens is you fuel the myth of Bouazizi. So that myth enters, coming from this radical outburst, enters the slow rhythm of daily life and fuels it and nurtures it in some ways, right? People still get angry. I mean, the imagery is so now we're I think moving into the realm of affect, right? So that's the best way I can think about it. It definitely needs more systematic thinking, but that's the best way I can think about it.
Okay, Radha?
Yeah, very, very quickly, I think that the way you put it, entangled temporality, is great. I mean, in a sense, I kind of alluded to the tension between what might be activism versus these flash protests, right? So it's the mediated instantaneity of these, and that we need to take seriously, because they, in fact, do exactly that. They make banal the issues that activists have given that sort of heavy emphasis. So I'll just stop with that, but it's a great comment. I did have a little question for Marwan. I know, Marwan, you, hi, anyway. You brought up sati and kind of linking different types of regimes of the body. And I was, I immediately thought of Gandhi, who was tried to, through celibacy, through hunger strikes and so on, was iconic of trying to make the body immaterial, the immateriality of the body in order to completely materialize the objectives of activism. So I was just wondering that, just a comment actually, that might be interesting literature for you to look at, unless you probably have already.
I also wanted just a quick question. I don't know if Omar Al-Ghazi is in the audience, because Omar's dissertation is looking at history and memory and how symbols of the past are brought back into activist practices. So it's something to look out for if he's not around.
He's working on his dissertation.
Yeah. That's what I thought.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Marvin. I thought your imagery about the cow as obviously delegitimizing a regime is alluding to a particular context, right? And this is actually very interesting, because in a very local grassroots activism, the context is well maintained. But in the digital sphere, if this is transported to the Indian context, it's not delegitimizing. In fact, the cow is sacred, right?
Yes.
So, or like the bear in a Russian context, how would that be perceived? So the point is, that would be very interesting, how these images circulate, and can that discourse, can your argument still hold as delegitimizing?
Yeah.
Or are you actually saying, no, context, we can somehow draw that contextual boundary here?
Yes, and this is an excellent question, and I think, is Noor in the audience? So I don't know if it's in the audience. For a few weeks at least, Noor's research assistant job was to gather images of the cow about Egyptian leaders. And some of the stuff she found, and so this is my answer to your question, which is that you have images that become self-contained. So you have the images, the metaphor of the dairy cow in Arabic. It means basically a source of wealth that is exploited, that's literally milked by people, right? So you have a graffiti or murals actually, where you see a cow in Cairo, and this is in Cairo and in Alexandria, where you see a cow and you have the tubes, what is it called? The handle that you carry to fill your car with gas coming out of the cow, right? And a bunch of the ministers in the government holding them. So basically, this is corruption, right? So the cow as metaphor for corruption. This kind of picture for an Egyptian, I would say for any Arab, I don't know how you would perceive it, but it's clear that the cow is a metaphor of corruption. a metaphor of the kind of decadence of and the corruption of the political class. So I would say that maybe the answer and the way I don't know how this would travel, right? I mean, the question you raised about India is very interesting, but I think in not only the Egyptian, but in the Arab context, the visuals become increasingly self-definitional, so to speak. So there's no room there's very little room within the Arab world for kind of intertextual slippages, right? The old jokes about you see Marlboro ads in a neighboring Arab country that you make jokes about, and when you see Marlboro ads, you know they're trying to sell cigarettes, but because you have the Far West theme in that other country you make jokes about, they start buying horses because they think they're promoting horses. You know, I don't think this happens in this case.
Just a quick follow-up on that. Now that would pertain to the fact that the Arab Spring is a Middle East sort of concern, but as we know that it has, crossed boundaries, right? And has become usurped by multiple nationalities. And so they have become part of the audiences of participation, and they are also now subject to those images,
yes.
Right? So the question then remains is that it can't be, I'm also curious about people who are part of the protest, realizing that part of their success is based on global media seeing that as legitimate, and thereby it circulates back into the nationhood, and that their audience of participation, particularly in the digital sphere, has changed. And can you actually hold on to local images without adhering to its multiple meanings in different contexts, if you want to spread and capitalize on the digital sphere?
Well, I mean, this is where you get into the spreading kind of diffusion versus going in depth and establishing roots for your movement. I mean, the length and the depth of the notion of the length and depth of ties can be applied perhaps to this. Yes, you want your images to circulate as far as you can. But you have to understand something very basic. In the case of the Arab world, adoption by the West is a liability more than it is an asset. Right, and so you have some of these revolutionary artists. Some of the images that spread the most widely, I'm becoming more and more skeptical of the global as a trope. But those that spread very widely became illegitimate in many cases in the eyes of the activists. Why? Because they were too busy mounting exhibitions in Amsterdam and in Copenhagen. They were too busy getting awards and literary prizes. They were too busy being the darling of CNN and the BBC, right? And that is seen, so the politics of authenticity kick in. People say, well, while we're risking our lives here under the bullets and the barrel bombs that Assad's throwing on our heads and still trying to spray some slogans on the walls, you are gallivanting in downtown Paris, having drinks, and so this is what happens, I think. So the proliferation of images is a double-edged sword, I think, especially when they get the endowment, the symbolic endowment of being art and no longer just activism, which happened a lot.
I have a question for Rada, but it may also apply to the stories that told by the other two speakers. I'd like to know a little bit more on the socioeconomic dimension of the story you told about that particular case, right? So the reason that this particular case or this particular victim aroused the national attention became the breaking point. Does that have anything to do with the socioeconomic status of the particular victim? And how did she differ from the rest of the victims of rape cases? Right. And how did the protest happen online or offline resonate with the rest of the social groups, like across, not just middle class or users of social media?
Right. I think there was a particular conjuncture that happened, right? So it was Shining India, the computer industry, which is why I kind of marked that she was out, she was a physiotherapist in a mall, watching Life of Pi, various ways in which those particular constellation of issues gain visibility. so at the very same time, there was just amazing amount of media attention on violence against women. And there were some cases of foreign journalists who had been raped and things that came to light in very interesting ways, right, because of that particular constellation. And immediately, even now, there's very, very little attention to that. So that was one. The other thing is also in the coverage, the global coverage was another story, was a very symbolic of not just shining India, but the breaking of the symbol. So, you want to make it as global, Tata can buy all the Jaguars he wants, but you're not going to cut it with this primal mindset. So there was this sort of resurfacing of this India as the computer center of the world and so on. So in a very short answer, but that it was in that assemblage of factors, which I think gained the kind of notoriety, global visibility that others haven't. Like, infanticide or sati came through in this sort of Orientalist optics, which was very different, but it's a different global optics. And I could not resist that, talking of the cow, that it was a cheese image, which I was curious. It was about the laughing cow,
Yes, well, do I have 30 seconds to explain it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah? So in right before Mubarak, when Mubarak came to power, Egypt had embarked on the politics of economic opening, and which was basically moving from kind of a more socialist model to what is now called neoliberalism, allowing foreign products to come in. And because Mubarak was instrumental in the process at some point, and because that's when Egyptians discovered laughing cow, they figured, okay, one of the reasons apparently is that it's not a very nutritional cheese. It doesn't taste very good, and he also really looks like the cow. And if you look at it's actually quite hilarious. But there is also kind of a social economic background to it.
Yeah, I have a question for everybody on the panel. I thought there's really a fascinating discussion, also from our comments from the floor. Very fascinating kind of tension in terms of the symbology, right, of the local activists. And on one hand, there is a tendency for these symbols to go viral, to flow around freely on a global level. But on the other hand, we also see the tendency, I think there's the localism, there's part of the efforts of the locals to try to embed these symbols locally in local culture and so on. So I wonder, how to think about this kind of relationship, right? The global and the local tendency, and the relationship of the symbols to the organizations and the people and the businesses behind them.
Anyone want us to take that on?
That's a tough one.
You don't have to.
Just a quick example, right? I'm sorry, may I? I can't see very well, so I don't want to interrupt anybody.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Ma.
Yes, please.
Yeah, just Govind, just the iconic case of the Zapatistas, right? When they were militating against the marginalization by the Mexican government for a number of years. Nobody paid any attention to them. As soon as they latched their cause to NAFTA and to the anti-trade movement, suddenly everybody was paying attention to them, right? So I think that's an example of kind of how they managed to exploit a globally resonant issue, and as a result were heard.
I think there's if I can add to that, there's goes back to your question also about linking of causes, and it makes me think of Madonna emblazoning "I am Malala," on her body, on a different side of her body, and losing local specificity. I think that the hitching on to that sort of global celebrity, in fact, takes away the particularities. I thought I'd throw that in.
I mean, what I'd like to add is, I think in the Afghan case, or Afghan and Pakistan case, many of the women's rights or human rights activists actually want to make the global leap, right? Because but global, I don't mean just Western, but aside from other regions as well, because there's funding, they can have allies, there's clout, and so they can get attention for their causes, and that can impact local change. But the question of what can you do to keep the images from going and being used in different ways, I think, there aren't that many copyrights or things with digital nature of the way images spread, and so that is very complicated. Yeah, have to do that.
Okay.
So
All right.
I don't think, you don't mean that you don't want the images to go global, right? Because that's a very part of the sharing economy. So,
Yeah, that's what I'm
meaning,
saying, that
in a sense,
I think Marwan had earlier said that adoption by the West is seen as a curse often in certain parts of the Arab world. My point was with the subjects that I've been studying, they want their messages and themselves to be spread globally. However, at the same time, they don't want, as Marwan also pointed out, they don't want to be seen as stooges or subsumed by the West, and so maintaining their local specificity is extremely important to them. For example, Malala Joya has been offered residency in numerous European countries and other countries, and she refuses that, even though she's under attack and constantly being threatened in Kabul, and she had to leave her native Farah. But she wants to have that, and she's unemployed. That was the reason why the U.S. gave for denying her the visa the first few times. But she wants to stay in Kabul because she wants to have that cultural local impact. Yeah.
Okay, if I can say a few words in closing. This has been a wonderful panel, and I'm particularly pleased that there's both the male body and the female body that's been discussed on the same panel, because strangely enough, that's rare, actually. And I think there's a long conversation to be had about the differences, similarities, the ways in which the male and female body in protest or in resistance or in oppression can be depicted or has been depicted. There was an interesting article by I think it was Maya Makdashi, saying, can the Palestinian man be a victim, for example? Or is it only women and children who can be victims? And so I think Marwan brought in sort of the male victims as well. And I think there's a lot to be said about that. Also, the way in Egypt sexual harassment has come up as sort of an issue coming out of the revolution rather than an issue that led to the revolution, but is certainly there now in ways that are very similar, I think, but different also. And Rada, you rightly, I think, said that the mainstream media makes these glib comparisons that are often, it's just a visual comparison. But I think we can go more in depth and see where there are real comparisons to be made, and especially if we go historically into the past. I mean, Egyptian and Indian feminism actually were very much in dialogue with each other under British colonialism. So, there are sort of histories that could be tapped as well. And your genealogy, I mean, I thought that was fantastic, all the women of the same family and then how they become sort of taken up in different ways and for different audiences and so on. So a lot to think about. A great start to our workshop. Thank you very much. We have a coffee break. Thank you, Marwan.
Thank you very much for including me. I got more feedback than I get at conferences where I'm actually physically present. So this is
all right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.